We're going to get started right on time because we do have to get our guest out of here for a flight. So welcome to this fireside chat this afternoon, part of Energy Week. I know a lot of you are probably planning on attending events throughout the week, but I just wanted to point out the URL energyweek.upenn.edu to register for any additional events. Today's fireside chat will be moderated by Professor Fernando Chengwei. He's asked me not to go into detail about his CV, and so I'll just say that he's a professor at the law school. And the goal of today's discussion is to explore the intricate intersection of human rights, climate, and immigration within the Global South. So I'd like to first welcome Professor Fernando Chengwei. As I mentioned, he's a professor at the School of Law. I will not go into his illustrious details because he said he threatened me with a hook, so he'll pull me off the stage if I do. So I'll skip to our guest of honor, our honored guest, from the University of Pennsylvania, Carey Law School, Bach Visiting International Professorship, Dean Raymond Atuguba of the University of Ghana Law School. He currently serves as the Dean of the University of Ghana Law School, a position he has held since 2002, with an illustrious academic career spanning continents. Professor Atuguba has left an indelible mark on legal education and human rights advocacy. He has held prestigious roles as a visiting professor of law and the Henry J. Steiner Visiting Professor of Human Rights at Harvard Law School. Over the years, he has taught an impressive array of courses, totaling almost over 40 at esteemed universities across Africa, Europe, North America, and Australia. Professor Atuguba's research intersects on constitutional and administrative law in the Global South, law and development in Africa, human rights and community lawyering, and he is a product of both the University of Ghana and Harvard Law School, where he pursued doctoral studies and obtained a Master's of Law degree. His academic prowess is complemented by extensive experience in various sectors, from the public sector, where he served as Executive Secretary to the President of Ghana, to the private sector as a team leader of Law and Development Associates, LADA, and managing partner of Atuguba and Associates. His expertise is diverse and far-reaching. Furthermore, Professor Atuguba's commitment to advancing legal frameworks and human rights extends beyond academia. He has provided consultancies, services to numerous African governments and collaborated closely with major international development agencies and NGOs. His extensive list of partnership includes entities such as the United Nations, World Bank, various regional and national organizations, and highlights his dedication to fostering legal and social change on a global scale. So I think he's a fitting panelist to talk about the topic at hand today. With that said, I will welcome Dean Atuguba and Professor Chengwei to the stage.
Hi, all. Welcome. Thanks for being here, and thanks for Kleinman Center, and thank you, Thabo, for putting all this together. So we only have an hour, so why don't we get right into it? Thank you so much for being here. Maybe we can start just telling us a little bit about yourself. Why in the world did you go to law school?
So I started off wanting to read medicine. So I was a science student. And then my elder brother did medicine, and I thought we didn't need two doctors. So I started looking for something else. I didn't want to be an animal doctor.
Okay, I bet.
I toyed with engineering for a while and gave it up. And then one evening in school, in high school, we had movie nights on Saturdays. And then they showed this South African movie. I almost certain it was Serafina, but it could have been something else, on the struggle in South Africa against apartheid. And after that movie, I decided I was going to be both a lawyer and a politician like Nelson Mandela.
Good
model. That's how I got
model.
into law.
Thank you. I'm still figuring out why I went to law school, but that's for another time. So, so part of the topic today is human rights, climate change. This is one of the first panels for Energy Week. So tell us we all think of different definitions of human rights. So what's your definition of human rights?
So I'm just coming now from a comparative constitutional law class at the law school. And I was telling the students that in Africa, we really need to remodel our constitutions. And part of that remodeling is the way in which we view human rights. because in the majority of African countries, people view human rights more as economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to development than as civil rights. And when we did the survey, we went around the entire country asking people what type of constitution they wanted. We did this in 2010, 2011, and we received over 86,000 written submissions and countless oral submissions. And the topmost issue was the right to development.
Development.
The right to development. And they wanted a developmental plan entrenched in the Constitution. They were prepared to go as far as that, which no government could change. Not a strict plan, but something broad enough to say we want every child to have an education up to this level. We want everyone to have access to healthcare. We want everyone to, that sort of thing. That was the topmost issue in the minds of people in the country. So you can't really, in my view, fully define human rights in the Ghanaian and in the African context without looking closely at economic, social, cultural rights and the right to development.
Excellent. Interesting, by the way, in the United States, we typically don't use the word human rights, like the police violated my human rights. We typically say the police violated my civil rights. But as you're pointing out, at the UN, we have two buckets, the civil and political rights, and then economic, social, and cultural rights. So against that context of the right to develop, the right of kids to go to school, you told me before we came here that the University of Ghana Law School is about 75 years old. Was there anything going on that led to the establishment of the law school 75 years ago? For example, not to put words in your mouth, there was violations of human rights, and then somebody said, let's get together a law school to train advocates to fight violations of human rights. So what was going on? What's the law? How did it get started?
So the university itself is 75 years, but the law school is 65 years. So it took them 10 years to realize they needed lawyers. But the more direct answer to your question is that the way in which law developed in Ghana is it forked somewhere. So we had this really charismatic leader who happened to attend Penn, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. His purpose for law was completely different from how we do it now. He had two purposes for law. When he established the Ghana School of Law, he said, the first thing I want this thing to do is, he didn't quite use the word, but he was thinking Pan-Africanism. So he was saying, we want to train lawyers who can help us forge a union of African states as a strong political and economic bloc. So the first thing was Pan-Africanism. The second thing was people-centeredness. And this is contained in his speech when he established the law school. He said, I want lawyers who would assist everyday people in everyday things that they do. Market women, building contractors. And he didn't talk about like big businesses and all that. He was talking about ordinary things. So the two things were clearly there. Now, after he did this,
and he was the dean or the founder?
He was the founding president of Ghana.
Okay.
Yes. And after he did this, the university then also established a faculty of law aiming at the complete opposite, to train lawyers for the normal things that lawyers do.
Represent big businesses.
Represent big businesses, which most of them do. So it's an interesting fork in the way in which and of course, I don't need to tell you which side won.
So most law schools, our own law school has a public interest department or little room with little filing cabinet. Actually we have bigger, the public interest center. Does the University of Ghana Law School have a place where students interested in everyday people, little people, can go and get support? Or are the courses mainly aimed at preparing lawyers to work in big business?
So part of what I've been doing in the last couple of years, and I've been doing just for 4 years, from 2019, 2020, is to reconnect with that Nkrumah vision. So for example, we're setting up an agric law clinic.
A what clinic?
Agric law clinic, agriculture.
Agricultural.
So an example of this disconnect is that a country that is 80% agriculture doesn't have an agric law clinic. Meanwhile, every day people have land tenure issues, lease issues, tenant farmer issues, and so forth. Because that vision of getting law to assist ordinary people in their ordinary lives never took off. If that had happened, we wouldn't have established criminal law clinics and other clinics before establishing an agric law clinic just now. You see?
Yes. So this leads us right to climate change, agricultural. So what, all right, so thank you for telling us about yourself. You didn't want to be a doctor and compete with your brother. The founder of the university had in mind helping regular people, and then the law school was founded, and it's not quite doing that, but you're bringing it back to maybe one of the reasons it got founded. And you're telling us that Ghana is 80% agricultural, and maybe the law school now with an agricultural focused clinic can help farmers.
Yep.
So could you tell us either from the Ghana perspective or the big country of Africa, what do you think are the top 3 issues or human rights violations facing, let's start with Ghana and then the rest of Africa, or maybe it's the same thing. What would you say, given your experience, top 3 bad things happening in Ghana?
So, I mean, Africa is a big continent. It's like 3 times the size of the United States. So it's difficult to talk in terms of the continent, but I think the 3 top issues I'm going to mention would cut across the continent very easily. I think the topmost issue on the African continent today is democratic reversals.
Democratic
reversals. In other words, many countries that were constitutional democracies are slipping back into dictatorships and military governments. So all the coups that we've ever had in the world from the 60s are 500. Now, think for a moment about the coups that occurred in Latin America, where we have a lot of coups. Okay, think about that. And imagine that half of these coups occurred in Africa alone, even if you count the coups from Latin America. Now, out of these half that occurred on the African continent, another half occurred in the West African region, where I'm from, where Ghana is. So it's really pretty bad. But things took a change for the better in the 1990s, where all of these countries went back into constitutional democratic rule. So at the beginning of this century, what we call ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, was 100%, not 99%, 100% under democratic constitutional rule.
They were following democratic constitutional law.
Do you know what that figure is now? 75%. In other words, a quarter of them have gone back into military rule, something that we never thought would happen. Okay. So that's the first challenge. And of the other 75, I would say that another half are just constitutional democracies in name, because there are significant depressions of constitutional governance within those countries to make them not full-fledged democracies. So in effect, half of the region is in trouble, and that's bad. If we continue on this trend, you're going to go to 3/4 and then 100%, and we are back in the 70s and the 80s.
So human right issue number 1, in your perception, is democratic reversals, where now maybe military rulers who clamp down on freedom of speech, freedom of this, freedom of that. Let's go to number 2. What?
Number 2, I think, is debt. I when I went to work with the former president of Ghana, I had one intention. I had been working and researching on the question, why is Africa poor when it has so much resources? And I couldn't find the answer. And so part of the reason I went into government was I need to find out what happens in government such that these guys cannot use all of these resources to get everyone out of poverty. It didn't take me long to find out. Every African country, when it raises its taxes, goes through 4 spending guides.
4 spending guides, okay?
First thing they do is to service the debt. You can't pay the debt. It's impossible. The debt is so huge, you can only service the debt, meaning you pay the interest on the debt. After you do that, and in Ghana, not too long ago, we're using close to 100% of all tax revenues to just service what? The debt. Yes, 90-something%. In fact, some calculations took it to 104%, meaning we didn't have enough taxes just to pay the debt. And so the government had to go and restructure the debt and to do haircuts. If you're lucky to do number 1, the next thing you do is you pay public sector wages. It means you pay people who work for the government. You know where the money comes from for that?
To pay the salaries of government workers.
Because you've used all of the taxes to service debt.
Where?
You borrow from the domestic banks, which means you go into further debt. So you take money from, you issue government bonds. Standard Chartered, Barclays, Citi, every bank is there. And just this past year, the banks in Ghana were making like 238% profit. So it's lucrative to own a bank in these countries. So you see, you can't even go to 3. You know what 3 is? Goods and services. Goods and services are what you need to let the government run. So there are offices in many African countries where you have the people pay the salary, but they can't work. Printer is not working, there's no ink, there's no paper to print. The lights, yes, this is reality. So you see, you can't get to 3. Even if you went, it is after you do number 3 that you now go to number 4.
So goods and services, but there's no goods and services because there's no products that the government workers can work
So you
with.
know what they
This
do?
sounds a lot like public schools in Philadelphia, but go ahead. What's number 4?
Do is you depend on donor funds and NGOs and the rest to get these things going. And then number 4 is now investment.
Non-investment.
No.
Investment.
So number 4 is when you now build the hospitals and build the roads and get the educational system working. And
But that's from money that's coming from outside.
you have to now borrow.
You have to borrow more.
That's why the
And so the
debt number
circle of-
1
yeah.
never ends,
Right.
because you have to continue
You're borrowing.
borrowing and getting into debt in order to get the wheel running. So it's a vicious cycle of debt. So that's the second most critical human rights issue. Because if you keep on this cycle, hospitals are not going to run. Because you can have buildings there, but they're not going to have gauze and syringes and equipment. The schools are going to be there as buildings, but the teachers are not good and they don't have the equipment to teach. If you go into some of these schools, they teach computer science with stones. Yes, you carve the stone and say, this is how the mouse looks like. And this is how you click. There are videos on these things. Third most important issue.
So just to review, military rule is a problem, debt is a problem, and my question is, what is the third human right issue? This is hosted by the Klein Energy Center, so maybe you'll say that the third problem is energy or climate change issues?
No, the third problem is poverty, but embedded in poverty is climate change.
Poverty.
Because a whole lot of the poverty issues are climate change related, if you take out those that are debt related.
Flesh that out. What do you mean that
So
embedded, that climate is part of poverty?
I've already told you how embedded in poverty debt is. Debt causes poverty. You take that out, there's climate change. And here, let me just get personal, okay? Because you know of all this stuff, but you don't know what I've experienced. Growing up in northern Ghana, the temperature kept going up. So, and there were times it went up before I left northern Ghana for the capital city. I still visit a lot though. It will go up to over 42 degrees Celsius. How much is that in Fahrenheit? It's 100 and something. How do you function in that environment? And by the way, there are no air conditions. And even if they are there, the lights will go off. And you can't pay the electricity bill if you turned it on. Okay. So in the afternoon, you can't think. You can't function. It's just too hot. You know? Then I realized the seasons started changing. Because it used to be like really clear. This is the time we plant. This is the time the rains come. This is the time we fertilize. This is the time we harvest. Then suddenly, there's a huge storm in the dry season. So you can't plan. Farmers can't plan. They sow the seeds, they sprout, and suddenly something just happens and it's washed off. And this is rain-fed agriculture, okay? So the unpredictability messes everything up. The flooding and the rest wipes off the investment, and it means that the next season there's not going to be food and there's going to be famine. And it is from selling the excess food that they're able to take the kids to school and cover health bills. So everything is messed up. When I was in university, one of my first holiday jobs was going around. I was working for the Catholic Relief Services, and I was tasked to go around and do an assessment of these things. Because when these rains unpredictably come and there's a flood and everything, houses would fall, animals would die, crops would be destroyed, I'll do the assessment and then write a report. And then we would get relief aid, and I have to go back to these places and then distribute it. One funny story, one time we had to use canoes, and the canoe was riding on flood water. So it's so flooded that you have to use a canoe. And then halfway, we realized the canoe was leaking. And it was like halfway, distance back, all water.
But you survived.
I mean, we had to like scoop out.
Of the
So
water.
as we were moving, we're scooping out and moving and scooping out until we got this. So climate change, real.
But that's a subset of poverty.
Yes.
And that's part of everything's the military rule, the debt to keep borrowing results in poverty, and that all has an influence.
Even in the cities, every year, there are unpredictable floods and people die because the infrastructure was not created for that. The infrastructure was created for what used to be predictable. Now it's not predictable. So suddenly there's a gush of rain and then there's flooding. It carries people away in their cars. They just die. It happens every single year.
So the climate change that's going on that you're describing, it's not dry heat, it's wet, it's floods, or
So
both.
I'm giving you just one example with the floods, but you also have the dry spells, which happens more in the northern parts, where you used to have like some fields where the cattle will go and graze, and then it suddenly dries up. And then sometimes you have to dry it up in advance and keep it so that in the dry season you can then feed the animals. But if it is done, it's done. And then you see the animals start getting emaciated, and people have their investments, their whole life investments in these animals. There can be a family that owns like 100 cattle, and that's it. If there's a medical crisis, they sell 5 of the cattle and they deal with it. If someone is going to high school or the university, they sell 5 of the cattle and they pay the fees. So to have that, it's like pushing an entire family, and we're not talking nuclear family, we're talking extended families, right into poverty.
So part of today's talk is human rights and climate-driven migration. And you mentioned at the beginning that 85% of the population is in the agricultural sector. If either because of either floods or dry heat, people have to leave, where do they cross a border? Do they stay, or are they internal, one part of Ghana to another? And if they do cross, where they cross to, are they accepted? So I teach human rights and refugee law, and the definition of a refugee is a person with a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion.
You should
There-
add climate change.
Would love to, but the international community does not have comma, climate change, period. So climate change is, so it's well-founded fear of persecution. The sun cannot persecute me. The water cannot persecute me. Typically, it's the bad soldiers. So given that climate change is not part of the definition of a refugee, where do Ghanaians go, and are they accepted when they go next door? Like, what's happening?
So they go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places, mainly. So there are those who escape into the sea. So they go into fishing. And you can make a living from that.
So
But then you
they
have-
say inside Ghana, but they go to the coast.
Exactly, but
to-
they go outside of Ghanaian waters and go illegally to fishing.
Oh,
You
okay.
get it?
Okay,
But they're not the only ones. They have to fight with Japanese and Chinese
Chinese.
trawlers that are also fishing illegally. So there's an issue there. The second place they go is to other countries, other African countries. Favorite is South Africa. And that's why xenophobia is a problem, because in South Africa, so many other nationals are coming into South Africa because of a strong economy and basing there and working off from there. That's the second place. The third is they go up to the Arab countries. But then a lot of research has shown that there's a lot of civil rights abuses for the people who go up there to work as domestic workers or other forms of work.
what countries are you talking about in the Middle East?
In the
Which
Middle
one-
East.
Which ones?
Oh,
All
I
of them.
think the favorite now is Dubai, but United Arab Emirates, but they go everywhere.
Mhm.
Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, all over. Saudi Arabia is another favorite. Yeah. That's the third place, right? The fourth is Europe. You pay somebody, they get you documents, or they don't get you the documents, and you stow away, or you go on a boat and you get into Europe. And then your work starts. Or the US. A lot of people paying several people lots of money to get visas to come to the US and never return.
For those of you who have cars, and if you're too lazy to wash your own car, you might take it to one of those places that wash cars, and then young men dry the cars with rags. So I don't have a car, but I did talk to one of these. I talked to several of these men. Many of them are from West Africa, either from Senegal or from Ghana. So they must have gotten a visa. Somehow they got a visa. They arrive at JFK or they arrive at Philadelphia International Airport, and then to survive, and they're probably college educated, but that's how you survive in the United States and maybe in Europe as well. All right, so as not to end on a sad note, it's 4:30. You've shared with us 3 human rights problems: the debt, the military rule, and poverty, which is and migration is a subset of poverty, driving people out, et cetera. So to each of those 3, do you have any suggestions for turning those challenges into opportunities? And then we'll invite you all to comment or have questions for the next 30 minutes.
Yeah. So I'm going to say these things simply, but they're not that simple, implementationally. So for the first one, on the military rule and the democratic reversals, we need to set out the various reasons why the military take over. And they are pretty similar. I just finished a paper on this, looking at the reasons people give for taking over governments. And they're pretty similar. It's like they read from the same, is it called tool book or whatever?
Toolkit.
Toolkit. And we need for each of these countries to do like a table and to watch those things. Just like you would watch whether or not civil rights are being abused, you need to watch when your country has too much inflation, because it's an indicator that the economy is not doing well. And one of the top reasons the military takes over governments is that the economy is not well and people are suffering and so forth. You should watch inflation. You should watch depreciation of the cedi. You should watch access to social services. You need to watch these things consistently. And then so the economic community of West African states should not only be concerned about press freedom and the number of hours people spend in jail before they get a lawyer. They should be also concerned and should track inflation, printing of money illegally by the central bank. All those things I mentioned. If we did that, there will be early warning signs.
There would be what?
Early warning signs. And then you can get governments that are governing badly to start reworking things to prevent coups.
So the military, so do you think, so the military generals who take over, they are saying if the civilian president is no good, look at how much life is expensive here, there's poverty, we're going to take over and make life better for you. And you're saying that if the civilian presidents looked at the rate of inflation, et cetera, and did something about that, there would be no need for the military to take over.
Let me give you an example. The military in Niger Republic just took over, okay? One of the things they did immediately was to start selling is it uranium or one of these really essential natural resources for cell phones and other things and whatever, nuclear powered energy. They started selling it. They stopped selling it to the French at 0.80, that's 80 cents per unit. I've forgotten the way the unit is crafted.
Whatever that mineral is.
And started selling it at 200 euros. What does that mean? That the civilian government was messing up its contracting with the French government and allowing the French government to take that mineral essentially for free. Can you blame the military?
The French are depleting our natural resources because we're giving it away to them for free.
That's why these coups, these military regimes sometimes have popular support. Because immediately they bring in a flash of money and they'll start selling it to, say, Russia. Okay? As I said, it's more complicated than I'm stating it, but the main point is there are certain indicators that you can look out and say, hey, there's going to be a military takeover in this country if we don't watch it.
If we don't do this.
Let's tabulate those indicators and let's watch them.
Okay.
For debt, simple. You need debt forgiveness. Debt forgiveness for colonialism, debt forgiveness for every horrible thing that has happened in the African continent. And by debt forgiveness, we don't mean what is done by the IMF and the World Bank. The IMF and the World Bank never forgive debt. They always restructure it. And the best thing they've ever done is to say, okay, we are forgiving you this debt, but use that money for A. You don't tell the countries to use that money for A, because maybe that's not the best thing that, and all of those programs, I've never heard of any program of that type of debt forgiveness by the World Bank that worked. Why would you say we are forgiving you this debt, but use the money to build pit latrines when there are no hospitals and there are no educational facilities? And if you don't use the money to build pit latrines, you don't get the debt forgiveness. That's not debt forgiveness. I'm talking of real debt forgiveness that wipes off the base debt. If from that moment you govern poorly and mount up debt again, it's your own business. But for now, unless that base debt is forgiven, none of these countries can move forward economically.
And do countries have, well, Ghana, does Ghana have internal capacity to figure out what do people really need so that we can tell the IMF and the World Bank, we don't need to build latrines, we need the money for. Is there a voice that pushes back to these international institutions?
But those voices never have the impact that they should have. I don't know why. Because we've had several debt forgiveness attempts. And what was generated internally, at least I know for Ghana, actually I know for other African countries, never worked out. Look for, I think we talked about this at the design school, look for the Lagos plan. There's something called the Lagos plan, where African countries gathered in Lagos.
Lagos, Nigeria, Lagos. Yeah.
And set out a developmental plan for how to get out of all these problems. Immediately the Lagos plan was done, the World Bank came up with their own plan, mimicking the Lagos plan, but fashioned not to work. I don't know what went into their heads. So the countries know what they need to do, but somehow they're not allowed to do what they need to do.
Finally, and then we'll open it up. The last problem is poverty, and related to that is climate-driven migration. What are some opportunities there to fix that problem?
Same solution. I think that if you deal with the debt problem and you watched the way African governments governed economically, you will deal with poverty. If you deal with the debt problem, you now release resources to be used to do the things that will get people out of poverty and to give the opportunities that will get people out of poverty. But that's not enough. You now have to watch the indices when a country is moving forward and when it's moving backwards, and ensure that these countries are moving forward. If that is done in addition to debt forgiveness, you can get rid of poverty.
By the way, is there an entity that is watching these indices, creating these tables regarding inflation at the UN level or at the African regional level? Who is doing this tabulation?
The World Bank does a lot of it. The IMF does a lot of it. But this needs to be done at the sub-regional and regional bodies. The AU, that's the African Union, and then the various regional, sub-regional bodies in Africa. Every part of Africa has a sub-regional body. East, West, South, those exist. They should be doing this work.
Thank you for being with us. First round of applause. We'll have another one in a few minutes, but questions, comments, reflections on what you've heard so far? Human rights, Ghana, top issues, militarization, debt, poverty. Yes. Tell us your name and where you're from, etc.
She looks Ghanaian.
I am. Hi, everyone. My name is Ajua. I'm a first-year Wharton MBA student. I actually just arrived from Ghana this morning with a Wharton Study Abroad program, so thank you for being here. I have two-part questions, and I think this is all because I just arrived, and so Ghana is really on my mind. My first is when we talk about migration and how that intersects with poverty and climate change, what are your thoughts on how we balance between interventions for, climate shocks currently, so looking at humanitarian aid versus interventions to protect vulnerable communities from the shocks from climate change long term? So what does, like for a country like Ghana, if you have X amount of aid, what should that division look like between helping people in the short term while also investing in things like seeds that are more resistant to climate change long term?
By the way, does it have to be or can it be and?
I'll leave that to.
Yes.
No, you have to, and this goes for so many other things and not just climate change. Part of what African leaders need to do, in my experience, is to design solution toolkits that navigate intelligently between these two. If you forget the short term, people are going to be dead by the time you finish implementing the long term. There will be nobody to enjoy the long-term benefits. If you focus too much on the short term, it's going to be an unending cycle, which means that you just keep putting the bandage on and the wound never heals. You have to be able to intelligently balance the two so that you're keeping people alive, giving people hope, whilst working seriously on the long term. And many governments never get the balance right. And so I know where your question is coming from.
Thank you. Other comments, questions, reflections?
Thank you. I was wondering,
What's your name and
my name is Sarai, and I work in AI in a Penn lab. My question would be regarding in the framework of the loss and damages fund discussed at the last COP, would a similar provision be legally plausible regarding climate migrants and refugees?
repeat the first?
Yeah, I didn't quite get
Yeah,
the
what's
first.
the first part of the question?
Regarding the loss and damages provision discussed at the last COP,
Ah,
would a similar provision be plausible for climate refugees and saying that, okay, the global north accepts a quota of refugees because of their industrialization?
Do you want to address?
yes.
Go ahead.
I think it would be smarter to fold this into the debt relief initiative. That's what I think. That this kind of compensation should be part of debt forgiveness. So you say, look, this is an assessment of the damage that is caused. This is the amount of compensation we are going to give, and we are going to give it in the form of debt relief. That way you can get these countries more out of debt and capable of moving ahead. The debt is really a stranglehold. If you did it outside of that, you would get some benefits, you get some money, but the debt is still there. Can't move with it.
Yeah, and from an immigration, refugee, migration perspective, as we mentioned, refugees are not considered, I mean, but people who leave their home because of climate reasons are not considered refugees. And even if you, and even for those people who are refugees, if they leave and their country gets better, it's, the big issue is getting your home back, your little yard back, because someone else has taken it over. So even for refugees, getting some sort of compensation if they go back is a big issue. Nicaragua, Cuba, if Cuba ever goes back to whatever it used to be, refugees going back to Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, the returnees, someone else is living in their house. So if they have problems, imagine climate migrants. I don't want to use the word refugees because they're going to have those. It's just a big legal issue. Other comments or questions? Someone here. What's your name and where are you from?
Oh, my name is Oluetu Tando. I'm from South Africa.
South Africa.
I think I just had a comment, and I think it's about sort of political instability and what causes it. And I would say probably it's the fallibility of our politicians, but also Western influence and interference within the African continent from a perspective of individuals and from organizations that come into Africa and in essence, they maximize their profits to the expense of the people more generally. And I think that's what causes and cascades down to issues in human rights, issues in political instability, people seizing and grabbing power. And I think it's happening everywhere. So I think that the solution to have less refugees would be to stop the stranglehold against Africa.
And you mentioned that. You said that when big institutions forgive your debt, they say, we'll forgive your debt, but you must use the money to do what we think you must use it for. We know better than you. Yeah.
I mean, you're exactly right. And sometimes it's, so we have crucial elections coming up in Ghana in 2024, December. And just to tell you how influential foreign entities are. Like, I have a personal project of going to the American ambassador, the UK ambassador, the French ambassador, the Norway ambassador, and telling them, can you just watch that the true winner of this election is declared winner? Otherwise, we're going to have civil war in this country. So if I have to do this, it tells you the amount of clout that these ambassadors and the countries behind them have. And you're very right. these countries can determine elections. Doesn't matter who wins. When I started working for the former president, the day his president died, he was vice president. And then the president died. And then he became president. And the moment the transfer of power was made, because we really don't regard vice presidents, guess who moved in to give him protection?
Who moved in to give him protection from when the vice president became president?
Not the Ghana military, not the Ghana police, not the Ghana Secret Service, US Marines.
Any final comment before we start wrapping up? Microphone. Go. Tell us your name and your affiliation.
I'm Bob Groves. I'm retired from a career in health and human services. I do teach some classes in human rights over at Temple Center City sometimes. So anyway, my two questions, and I'm here sort of as a citizen, interested citizen. Two questions. One, when you talk about debt, who has control? Who's getting paid when all this debt is owed? Number one. And number two, do you have anything to say, or what sources of hope do you have that things will get better? Those two questions.
So who is getting paid? Everybody. So this is where the money comes from. So African countries just keep on borrowing, and they borrow from a number of places. There is multilateral debt, which means you borrow from multilateral agencies like the IMF and the World Bank. And the World Bank and the IMF are increasingly looking to private entities to provide the money, and they provide the guarantee. So it's very simple to say this is World Bank money or IMF money. Okay, it's probably Bank of America, Citibank money, or some corporation. But then the multilateral agencies provide the guarantee, which is good for the private enterprises because they're almost certain that the money will be paid. So aside that, there's bilateral aid. Bilateral aid is not that much money. It looks big in size, but it's always dedicated to something. 3/4 of it goes back to the country of origin because the experts come from there and a lot of the services are from there. If you have like a USAID grant, you have to fly American Airlines or which is the other airline that is owned by whatever, okay? So bilateral might look big, but somehow a lot of it goes back to the country of origin. Then there is the domestic debt. It's not right to call it domestic because the majority of the, at least strong banks, would be foreign banks. So the strongest banks in Ghana would be Standard Chartered and Barclays Bank or that sort of thing. And then they would provide the short-term government bonds money. Then there are the Eurobonds, and then the floating of shares all over the world, including in the US. So they would sell government bonds to American shareholders, sometimes individuals, but also corporations, and then to European individuals and corporations. So these are the key areas from which the money comes. I remember advising the president I worked for that, diversify your debt portfolio. It's not good the way you're going. You're going for, your predecessor went for 3 billion from China. That's too much exposure. Cut it down to half. So do 1.5. And then when he asked me to go and negotiate that, I was detained in the China airport for a long time because I'm sure our communication must have been viewed somewhere. And then I said, and then we brought the Minister for Finance in, and I said, why do you have to go to the IMF? You know of all the conditionalities, blah, 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 blah. You know very well that your friend in Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan, can give you 2 billion. Go to South African for 2 billion. Go to Qatar for 2 billion. And it all looked sensible. And then the Minister of Finance said, yes, looks sensible. But if you don't take the IMF loan and you don't take the World Bank money, your ratings are going to go down.
Your what is going to go down?
Ratings. There are ratings for all these countries. And the reason why you go to the IMF and the World Bank is for credibility, so policy and financial management credibility, and not for the money. Sometimes the money is very little. And that's when I understood what it was all about. But I kept fighting. And all they did was they waited. When I left the country briefly, they announced that they had gone to the IMF. So I was in Boston when I heard that Ghana had gone to the IMF. We've been to the IMF 17 times, and we are still in debt. How many times do you need to go to know that this is not workable?
Credibility.
Hope. There's a lot of hope. You know, when I look at, sometimes when I just travel around the country and I see people with energy, drive, creativity, I say, wow, you know, there's something about this continent that you can't, that's why we're still rated the happiest people on the planet. Although things are look so horrible, it's there. There's a lot of hope. We just need to fix a few things. And I'm certain these 3 things I've mentioned, if we were to focus on them, we could really turn this continent around. Because the people there, they are smart, they are hardworking, they are resilient, Let me tell you a story, maybe that's the last thing. And this is a true story. The president of Senegal, one of the very first presidents, Leopold Senghor, he had a conversation with a French industrialist. And the French industrialist was confused and frustrated. He said, I run the same thing in France. Look at the profits I'm making. I'm running the same thing here in Senegal, even better. Running at a loss. What's happening? And then Leopold Senghor told him, feed your workers well. Treat them well and let them sing whilst they're working. Economic miracle. His profits surpassed the operations in France. Sometimes we don't do the things that we need to do to open up African possibilities because we don't know to do them. Who would have thought that singing increases African productivity? And then I remembered when I read that text that anytime we form bands, we're bands of young men, sorry, no women, who would move from the fields of each of our parents in turn to farm the fields with hoes. And when we're farming, we're singing. And in one day, we would all go together and clear the field for one parent. And if it was just the kids of that parent working, they would take weeks. In one day, we finish it. The next day, we move to the next one, finish it. The third day, we finish it. In a week, we've done work that could have been done in several weeks.
Local productivity.
Thank you.
Last question before we go to reception. Actually, we need to start closing up. Is there anything here, is there anything that these folks, young leaders of tomorrow or today, can do to support your efforts? Any opportunities that they can take part of?
So the solutions to these problems cannot be done from within Africa. It's not possible. I've seen several good African leaders try and fail because partly they didn't build the global networks and the international understanding that is needed to solve these problems. You can't solve the debt problem unless American and European investors who've bought the Ghanaian Eurobond understand that they have to give off part of their investment to get a country to move forward. It's not possible. So no matter what you do within Ghana, it's not going to work. You need the international networking and the international understanding on both sides to get this thing done. That's why we're discussing with the Kleinman Center on how to connect not just lecturers and researchers, but students, graduate students, undergraduate students from Africa and the US.
Well, today you've raised our awareness of what's going on there, and hopefully if you can stay on for a little while, if any of you have anything to give the Dean, your time, your talent, your treasures, please share it so that we can continue to expand this international network. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you.
Thank you to our speakers today. Thank you, Dean Atuguba, for all your insights, and Professor Fernando for keeping us moving. We will have a small reception right outside, courtesy of the Kleinman Center for Policy. I hope that some of you will be registering for follow-on Energy Week events. I think the next one is tomorrow morning, maybe, I think. 2:30 tomorrow morning. You can register again at energyweek.upenn.edu, and we hope to see you there. Thank you.